Welcome, everyone, to the Contact Center Perspectives podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. And today we've got a really interesting topic and a gentleman, Mark Bernardo, who's on with us today. Now, our topic, Mark, is how to take charge with a champion growth model. And this is a lot of tentacles and legs into the entire organization, but your passion, right? And you say it because you've been in everything from engineering to data science to customer success. You always come back to help supporting the customer. That's where your passion is, right? And so this champion growth model is going to have a lot that we talk about in that area. But it's interesting because you've got a lot of interesting things in your life, in your reality that kind of play into this empathy and how that's going to be a big part of what we talk about here today. And you liken it to the 25 years you spent in martial arts. And I want to hear a little bit more about that. You've got a 4-year-old son, congratulations, or just about to be 4. That's an exciting time in life. But here's what I'd love to do. You are the VP of Customer Success at IP Fabric, but that just starts to define who, Mark is. If you wouldn't mind, take just a minute and give us a little bit more about your background before we get started.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you very much, Steve. This is a pleasure and a privilege to be on this podcast, and I look forward to a robust conversation. My background, been in industry, been in corporate my whole career, right out of college, been in some form of leadership capacity for about the past 25 years. And why that is, I think, most relevant and important is it allowed me to see the business from a bunch of different angles, and not just internally, but externally. And also figure out the different lenses we have, right? When we're sitting in an engineering seat, we're about building products and about delivering features, right? We're in a marketing seat, we're about promoting that vision. And when we're in a seat connecting to customers, we're about transcending pain, delivering outcomes, right? And really creating champions, right? So I've definitely been in all those realms. And to capitalize on what you just said, I always come back home, right, to customer facing orgs in one way, shape, or form or another. And that's the role that I occupy today. Other things about me, a 4-year-old certainly keeps me active and certainly energized on a daily basis. But my wife and I also run an organization, a nonprofit called the Courage Campaign, where we primarily work with kids in K-12 and really give them tool sets through movement, through breath work, through journaling, through introspection, and through some challenging questions at times to really a sense of courage and resiliency and belonging, right? It's just some real characteristics that we think transcend really well into corporate space. And then, 25 years in the martial arts. And I'll be honest, I believe that I've always been somebody who has looked at empathy as a real high quality trait. But where that really hit me the first time was when I transitioned from student into teacher in the martial arts, where now you have people that are looking for you to help deliver against their outcomes. And we like to often put things in a box, which is, if you're coming to learn a martial art, clearly you're here to defend yourself and you have very specific outcomes in mind. And for some people, that is true. And for other people, it is about actually learning the art, learning the history, learning all the forms and all of the different 10,000 variations, right? And other people, it's to overcome something inside them, right? They just have fear. And it is less about the physical part and more about the mental part. So really what I learned is I approached it in a very formulaic way. And pretty quickly, my students showcased where there were gaps in how they were feeling about their experience. And that was a transformative time for me. And then lo and behold, I got to see the same things come into play when I got to work with customers in my role early on in my career. And that's where a lot of the dots started to connect. Yeah, a little bit about me.
What a great story, right? Because it really, in the world of business and our customers, we have to be significant students of our customers. And we can't assume that the reason why they're having these challenges or why they're coming to us in the first place is what we think. You just gave 3 distinct reasons why people would want to join martial arts. And you're right. I always felt, I want to feel safer out and around. I want to be able to defend myself. That may be part of it. It may not be it at all. And so the customer is the voice of highest authority in all of our businesses. And if we don't understand why they're coming to us, why they're having a conversation, a dialogue with us, why they would stay with us, why they would sign up again, then we're missing big opportunities. And you are very tied into that. You mentioned a couple of times already, empathy. And I want to understand how that works in this growth model and how to take charge of the champion growth model. I want to turn it over to you and just tell us a little bit more, just to get an understanding just from the foundational level. What is the champion growth model?
Yeah, it starts with outcomes and really making sure we can actually name what they are, right? Features don't move market. And if we use the example that you were just talking about, which is really understanding, given that customers are the kind of the de facto source of truth, really understanding not just what they desire, but what stood in the way of those desires previously. So if we were to think about, as an example, if you think about Peloton, they were on fire and they did nothing different than so many other online platforms did. But what they did is they created a community and they created accountability around a very tightly integrated system of hardware and software. So the hardware and the software was how the outcomes were about like transforming people's lives and making them feel like they belong. That was what people were thirsting for, especially people who couldn't make it to the gym, especially during COVID, right? If you think about when they really hit it. So they were so tuned in empathetically to where people's pain were. It wasn't just, I have a need to work out. I have a need to be seen and to belong and to feel like we're all celebrating together. Right. And that's where it really starts. When you think about the champion growth model, it is about being able to synthesize outcomes first and foremost. Let's name what we're trying to do. And then let's use empathy as that guide, that navigation piece to wind your way through. What has stood in the way of this occurring in the past? How do you feel about your role on a daily basis? What's holding you back? And oftentimes it starts with technology or data that I can't get, or insights I can't derive, or I can derive them, but it's just really hard, right? That's where it starts. But once you really establish a relationship and trust, what happens, right, on the ongoing conversation? They start to connect dots. It might be a throwaway comment or something else, but they start to connect dots in terms of friction they may be feeling internally. I'm hearing it from my leadership, right? They're really getting frustrated on our inability to do X, Y, and Z. Okay, let me help you be a hero in this story, right? Let's work together on looking outside the technology and really think about how to connect dots for your leadership in a more compelling way. If it starts with trust and if it starts with outcomes, and then it goes to this whole concept of empathy as the way we're going to navigate through it. Well, now once I see you and I feel you, it's about really creating trust. And that's going to be driven through consistency, right? The root of a lot of pain when it exists with customers is variability, right? I talked to you today and you deliver on point. You said what you were going to do and you delivered on it. And then tomorrow you forget about it, or you don't follow up, or you're breaking the mold, right? You're inconsistent, and that is going to break down trust, right? So then that's the next piece of that model. And then the last piece, it's a little bit more difficult because it's something that there needs to be a condition that happens that gives you the space to really push through the wall. And that is when there are emotionally charged moments, right? When customers are feeling the most against the wall and they're frustrated, fearful, their plant is it like whatever it is, right? There's a critical outage. How you show up in those moments is what they remember, right? And so if we think about that champion growth model, right, that is how to create your champion. And then, natively from there, once you have a champion, it's about how you get introduced to other people who can then make new champions, right? But it really needs to start with that absolute trusted, deeply trusted relationship with whoever your key stakeholder is. And it could be a user or it could not be a user. And I think that's the other thing you've got to navigate, right? Sometimes it's both two people, right? But usually starts with a buyer and then it navigates through user community, and then the user community transitions right out to other stakeholders.
Here's what's really interesting. When you said it starts with outcomes, right? There's a lot of ways you can do work back, right? If this is the outcome, how do I work back at there? And there's a million different ways that you could work back and then get to that outcome. All three levels that you went through, from empathy to trust and on down, had a very much, you talk about an emotionally charged, the bottom level, an emotionally charged where you're showing up, right? All three of these levels are completely full of emotion, right? Empathy and trust, and then these emotionally charged moments here. So am I to take away from this that the champion growth model even in the hardest core B2B environments, right, is all about B2C and B2B? Is it all about the emotional connection with the customer from the company? Is that what my takeaway should be?
I would say this, right? Anybody who has worked with me or for me will know that I say this probably way more than I should, right? Which is data matters, but emotions matter more. So you always need the objective pieces of the data, right? That is what is going to frame out and satisfy the core KPIs, right? The checkbox components. Without that, it's almost, how we think about people who stay at work, right? If you don't compensate them just basically fairly and you don't treat them well, then nothing else matters. But if you compensate them fairly, even if they're not getting like the top end salary, if you compensate them failure, you've checked out the box. Now it's all about how are you helping me grow? What's my community like? So those KPIs, the database piece is the table stakes. The differentiation, how you get to champions is through emotion. It's about connection. 100%, in my opinion. I'd love for anyone who has a different point of view, I'd love to have a robust conversation.
I think our lives are driven by emotion, whether we want to admit it or not, but we make decisions. Certainly we have facts and figures and we look at things rationally, but we do things emotionally about how they help us or they help our children and their welfare, right? How we succeed. So here's my question is, how do you set up a team structure, a framework, a business process, right, that succeeds at delivering outcomes through such emotionally charged paths to that outcome? Because we don't necessarily do that, especially in business. We tend to think more rationally than we do emotionally, usually. So how do you flip that model?
Yeah, you have to open the aperture first and foremost, right? Like, I think the biggest failure mode that a lot of organizations have is when they try to answer your question within the confines of the customer organization. So that's CS's problem. That's the CX problem. Or sometimes they put it in the UX bucket, right? Which is on the product side, but they give that solution to a team. And the way you have to solve it is you have to influence the organizational culture. So we could have the best CSM on the planet. And then if that customer has a conversation with the customer support person and they are brushed off or they are not seen or they don't think their priority is being tended to, that's a failure mode, right? If customer support and customer success are completely in alignment, and then there's a salesperson that has a follow-up call about selling renewal or upselling, and they're really aggressive, that's going to be a point of disconnect, right? So the first thing you have to understand is where are all the touch points, right, within the organization? Who talks to the customer? How do they talk to the customer? And then where can we provide tools and insights to enable them to have a more constructive dialogue? And oftentimes, because you can't necessarily change the world overnight, sometimes it's really simple. Like once things have moved to the customer success organization, if you don't have the framework or all the processes in place to do that yet, there's a very simple thing you can do. As long as your CSM is at least armed with the same philosophy and understands how to show up, then there's a simple question, right? At least for right now, if you need to jump on with the customer and it's for a high priority issue, just pull the CSM in. Let's have a pre-call. Let's do some type of dialogue. Just a way to not just make sure that the customer advocate is on, right, the conversation as well, but to actually show to everyone else how we actually show up in those moments of concern. And then obviously there's the normal process pieces where you can't just focus on the native, right? This is how to effectively drive adoption and education and understand usage and all that. But it's all key. But what questions do you ask? What data points do you look for? How do you know if you need to pull on a string? And sometimes it's even about just understanding what history said, right? If this customer was notorious about showing up on calls consistently for a year, and then in 3 calls in a row, they're just not there with an excuse, that is a screaming data point that just begs of something went wrong, right? Clearly something went awry that you need to do some outreach on.
You keep throwing out really interesting points. And I want to come back to, because at the beginning of the answer there, you talked about an internal company culture. To the question about how do we create a team dynamic, right? A company dynamic that can focus on these emotional paths to get these kind of outcomes. And you said it, you have to have the right company culture. And we know that to deliver the kind of outcomes that you're talking about, there's got to be significant training, significant investment in the internal teams. We want low turnover, like all the things that are traditional, right? But retaining good people is really hard. Attracting good people and retaining good people is really hard. And especially if you can get them to the point where they can really deliver a champion growth model, like you're talking about here. But if they're engaged, does that help engage as an employee and feel like they're catered to from an empathetic, from an emotional perspective, that they're safe, that they're important? Is that an important part of this champion growth model? Their engagement and then the halo effect?
Absolutely. Because if you think about any relationships, if you're in a room and you're talking to a group of 20 people and those 20 people are just looking away or looking down, or basically you hit out the most passionate pitch that you've ever given. And if you don't feel like that pitch is resonating or that people care, like your passion is going to start to be immediately impacted. Right. And then so it goes. Right. So 100% true. People that show up well need to feel like them showing up well is worth something, right? That they have to feel that. And without that, they're never really going to be able to lean into that growth mindset because they're going to show up inauthentically with the customer. And there's an interesting data point. So there's a woman by the name of Frances Fry. I don't know if she still teaches at Harvard, but she was a Harvard professor. She's wrote a few books, one with her spouse, Ann Morris. But one of the things she talks about is this trust triangle, right? And what she talks about there is there's three vectors to it. One is effectively logic, right? Do people understand natively what you're doing or why? The second one is authenticity. And the third one is empathy. And either one of those three don't show up, you're not going to garner trust. So if you go back to your original question, people who don't feel like the work they're doing is being seen, then they're not going to show up authentically. And that will immediately be the first break point in people feeling a sense of connection and trust.
Do you have a story, right, where showing up, displaying empathy, either internally with somebody on your team that charges them up or the customer themselves, like we remember things 22 times better when they're told to us in the form of a story, right? Is there a story that brings this to life for us?
There's one very compelling one, at least for me, and so it was one of the times that I'm like, yeah, this is it. And this one was a customer story, and it was relatively early in my career, actually, but I was leading the support team at the time. And we had this customer. He ran a very large manufacturing plant down in Australia, and he was using our software to effectively run the plant. And he was just a very angry person. Like, people hated working with him, like viscerally hated working with him. The support team would be very rote with their answers, like zero empathy. They would answer the questions, but no personal investment at all. The product team would brush him off. The executives were fed up listening to him because all he did was complain. But he was a really big customer, right? And he was running a plant. He was running a plant with our software, right? So regardless of anything else, that needs to mean something. So on this one particular day, there was a pretty critical escalation where we actually affected his plant operation. Like, the plant shut down and he lost production and he lost his mind as a result of losing that production. So the escalation hit my desk, and it was relatively late in the day when the escalation hit my desk. And I asked if he could meet, and he could. It was 11 o'clock my time, PM. So I jumped on a call and we had a very long conversation, and true to form, he was very angry and I let him be angry. And the only thing I ended with him is like, I can't promise you that I'm going to be able to resolve these things overnight, but I promise you that I'm going to be here, right, with you, and we're going to figure out our way through this, right, together. We're going to bring everyone we can on this. You have top priority, the whole thing. And for a period of 6 weeks, there wasn't just one problem. For a period of 6 weeks, we had a twice weekly cadence where I showed up to every one of those somewhere between 11 p.m. and midnight every time. And occasionally we'd pull in some critical engineers, and over that time, you could watch his whole demeanor change. And again, we didn't resolve all the issues overnight, but we started resolving issues, and he felt heard and he felt seen. And at the end of that process, there was a different gentleman on the other end. So much so that he was one of our biggest promoters. And he was even like on keynotes with us talking about the product and the outcomes. So that's just it's a tangible moment for me, because the only thing that really changed was someone willing to meet them where they were, to listen to their pain, to empathize with the pain, and then show up in a way. Yes, technology mattered. Yes, we need to fix problems, but that wasn't his frustration. His frustration was nobody gives a crap about what I'm feeling. And that's where it started.
Just to regularly show up at 11 or 12 o'clock at night showed that you cared, right?
Yeah. That's all he was looking for.
Yeah.
How dare a company force me to call in on their times? At the time, we also had a center in Japan, but they weren't an engineering center. They just took calls. They couldn't fix the problems because I don't feel like you are meeting me where I am. And that's all it really took. That was the first domino that fell.
There's those seminal kind of moments, but then you talked about over a period of time and you consistently showed up. And the whole thing, actions speak louder than words, right? You consistently delivered actions that supported him in ways that he felt like you were going over and above. This consistency of experience across like customer touch points, how does that fit into the champion model?
Yeah, like the consistency of experience goes back to this whole concept of variability, right? So every single touch point we have is an opportunity to influence the brand, right? Period. And when it comes to consistency, it is about just truly, right, being predictably reliable. I think about early in my career at GE. So GE obviously was very focused on Six Sigma and high degrees of measurability. And I think that the interesting thing that I was exposed to early on was this whole concept of say do to the nth degree. And the example that we used was this. So most of us would assume if I promise to supply something to you and I deliver early, that's a good thing, right? Most people would believe that's a good thing. And what we found is we had a bunch of customers who thought that was a horrible thing because they're waiting for inventory to come in. And if it comes in early, I need a place to put it, right? Which means there's cost. And if it comes in late, that means I can't use it effectively and I'm impacting production. If you say it's going to be here on this day, then deliver it on this day and be reliable about it. And that was a really interesting moment for me because it challenged our normal narrative, which is early is always better. You know, like doing what you say you're going to do is what's best. And being very consistent and reliable about that is what's best. And even if you think about, I'll transition to the kids, right? How do kids develop trust? It is about being consistent, right? It is about saying the same thing over and over again and not veering from how you show up, right? So yeah, I think it's hugely important.
You speak so passionately about this. I'd love to know, like, across your career, what are you the most proud of? I know you've come back and you always come back to customer support. What are you the most proud of that you've been able to accomplish?
Honestly, I think the thing I'm most proud of is that for most of my career, it was all about people and how that has manifested. It's so interesting because you just don't know how you impact people. There's the general normal connections that you make, which is like the leaders that you've helped develop, right? That still come to you today and you have a really rich relationship where they're continuing to share lessons that they learned from you. And the funny thing is you can share lessons that you learned from them, right? Like I'm really proud of relationships that are so trusted where like I can be vulnerable too. And I can basically learn from others around me. And I see the type of leader they've become and knowing that potentially somewhere along the line, something I did or something I said enabled that to happen was huge. And then the other piece, I remember I was at this executive training event and we were all reflecting at the end of the event, what was the biggest takeaways? And this person that was in our team, and I worked with them, but it wasn't anything deep. But the person was in our team, what they shared was, I appreciate the fact that Mark always looked to create space where I felt safe. I felt not just safe in terms of presence, but safe in terms of speaking, right? So that to me is probably the thing I'm most proud of anything that I've done. Because I think not only does it impact businesses, but it impacts community and humanity at some level as well.
Amazing. You should be very proud of that when somebody feels they come out outwardly tell you that you created a safe space for them. That is a very proud moment. I have one last question because we've talked about so much here, right? If there was one thing that your peers that are consuming this podcast now, you want them to take away, what would be that one main message?
Every single decision, every single touch point is both a moment to influence and a moment to learn. I truly believe that every single interaction, there is friction to be discerned because there's always friction there. And there are moments and opportunities of elation, right, and wins to learn, like just where you have blind spots. So that would probably be the big thing for me.
Mark, here's one thing I do know. People are going to have questions. Would it be appropriate that I gave out maybe a link to your LinkedIn profile that people could reach out to?
Love that. Absolutely.
Fantastic. The mission of this podcast is to bring all of our different perspectives of leaders throughout the industry, our insights, what's worked well, where we've had failures, all those experiences. And if we can share those, that's like the rising tide that lifts all boats. And I think it gave us just so much to think about today in such a positive way that you played a big part of that rising tide. I just want to say thank you.
I'm going to give you a thank you in return. There's not a lot of podcasts who take this, what I'll just call an outer rim approach to connecting dots. Again, we think about boxes, right? People take a very formulaic lane around here's the 10-step process to effective customer success organizations. But if we go all the way back to this whole concept of emotions, and at the end of all of this is people, there's a lot of nuance there. And you really got to understand and have a strong nuance if you're going to create the type of momentum that you want. So.